so pleased. I'm so pleased to have Dr. Rachel Talley present for Focus. I got to know her through a community program and was led to her, given the fact that she runs the fellowship in community psychiatry at Penn. She's also the associate program director for the residency program in adult psychiatry. One of the reasons she's talking today is this incredible thing that she has put together on COBOL around mental health for people at Penn. I think she is remarkable. We had her present to students who are working in the community, and her sensitivity to their level of training and what they might be facing was just remarkable. So she's had lots of awards and so forth. You should read her bio, but I could go on and on about her, but I am going to turn it over to her.
Well, thank you so much. And I'll first say I'm delighted, humbled, and flattered to be here to share about this and my experience with this initiative, the Spaces of Color program on the Cobalt platform. And one piece I'll say, in a sense, is sort of modifying a little bit of what how Lucy framed this, is that while I've been honored to be the director in name of this program, it really truly is, it's a group grassroots effort. And so I really see myself as being here to present this work that I've been privileged and humbled to work on with several colleagues at Penn and really grow this initiative together. And so I'm hoping to share a couple of lessons learned from that experience. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I will say, as I'm presenting, feel free to share questions and comments in the chat. And I know our plan is maybe to have some questions and discussion at the end, but sort of hold those until the end. Right, I hope we tested that. I hope my screen is visible and everything. All right. So again, what I'm going to be sharing about today is the Cobalt Spaces of Color initiative and just a few of my lessons learned being a part of this program. And I want to start out with an acknowledgement of some of these wonderful folks in the Penn community who I have developed this initiative with. I'd like to particularly shout out my co-facilitators who run these groups with me, Alicia Johnson, Andrea Blount, and Reverend Betty White, as well as colleagues who have been part of a spin-off group of our main Spaces of Color initiative, Spaces of Color for AAPI. And that's Annie Pern, Christina Votang, Stacy Pham, and So Ra Cho. And so I share this work with them, and I'm pleased to sort of be here representing it on their behalf. And I also want to acknowledge the wonderful team at Penn Cobalt, as well as Dr. Lisa Bellini, who's been a huge support for this initiative. And so just to give a little bit of a roadmap, what I'm hoping to share with you today is a little bit of the history of how the Cobalt Spaces of Color program came about. Both some of the sort of the historical antecedents that brought it to bear, as well as some of the sources of inspiration that I drew upon in terms of kind of figuring out what this program would look like and some of its structure. I'll be sharing a little bit from the research literature, but one piece, jumping to one of my lessons learned that I want to add in here, is that while I think elements of how we've approached Spaces of Color resonate with certain types of programs and types of providers that have been studied in the research, this really was not sort of that sort of top-down ivory tower academic sort of initiative in that way. And I think a big lesson that I've learned in putting this program together is that while my typical approach as someone trained in academia, coming from that space, has been to sort of first look to the literature evidence and the formal research to decide how to approach something, I think a really important lesson that I have learned in doing this work is really, in a sense, going in a reverse direction and thinking more about what is the community looking for and what is the community needing and calling for as far as a structure, and what almost sort of feels right in a gut sense as far as what will support folks. And then I found sort of in a backwards way that much of the work that my co-facilitators and I have come together to try to do, I think resonates with some of the work and approaches that are out there in the literature evidence, but that this really has been more about our sort of feeling our way along as far as just what is felt right and what we're hearing from community members who attend these groups. I'll also then share a little bit about the program structure and outcomes, and then wrap up with some lessons learned. And then we'll be eager to hear feedback and questions and comments on what I share. So starting out, I think what is really, at the end of the day, what was the key, a really tragic and painful inspiration for bringing together a group like Spaces of Color, was of course what I would frame as sort of in 2020, what was a revitalized national dialogue around issues that are longstanding, of course, and far predated 2020. And in particular, much of what fueled our sort of drive and inspiration to come to this work was the highly publicized killings of unarmed Black Americans, both nationally and locally here in the Philadelphia community, the emotional reactions of our Penn community to those incidents, and just some of us feeling called to think about, well, what can we do to support folks who are experiencing the pain and the vicarious trauma of these incidents? I hope that these faces up here on the screen are familiar to you, but just to say their names and call them out. This is Mr. George Floyd, of course, on the left. Ms. Breonna Taylor, and then Walter Wallace Jr., a gentleman with mental illness who was unfortunately died in the custody of police, unarmed, in our own Philadelphia community. And so incidents like this, I think, were really much of the fuel and the fire that brought our facilitator group to think about, what do we do about the fact that these incidents, whether they occur in our local community, whether they occur nationally and are publicized widely, that they hurt. And they particularly hurt when you're a person of a marginalized identity who sees something like this happening, can see yourself in that individual and feels that sense of pain and sorrow and grief that can come with seeing people who look like you being mistreated in this way. So I think this is really a key bedrock piece of it's hard to even use the word inspiration, right? Because it's a painful and tragic inspiration. And yet this was the fuel in a way for what brought about this initiative. And so moving from there in terms of what brought our group together. So in 2020, this was also the time at Penn when the Penn Cobalt platform was launched. And I hope those on the call, I know I see a lot of familiar faces from the psychiatry department that I imagine many are familiar. But basically, Penn Cobalt is a mental health support resource that was launched both by the departments of psychiatry and other leadership within Penn, basically providing a whole array of complementary mental health and wellness support resources for folks in the Penn community. And so amongst those resources, I and a couple of colleagues in the beginnings, I'd say, so around the spring, summer of 2020, came together to try to create an initiative called Conversations on Race and Racism, which was really focused on, in a very broad way, just seeing if we as mental health providers could facilitate open dialogue around race and around racism, knowing that these issues had leapt into prominence in a way that they had not been as prominent in years prior, knowing that there are all sorts of reactions, all sorts of conversations going on. Our hope was that we could draw on our background in mental health in terms of dealing with difficult conversations to provide spaces for people at Penn to discuss these issues. These groups were very broad-based and folks of all identities coming together. And I'll say that in a sense, a very obvious, very quick lesson learned in facilitating those groups is that, of course, when it comes to race, comes to racism and identity, that the need in conversations like this can be very different if you're a person who has been impacted by racism or has been the victim of racism, as opposed to if you're a person who is coming to learn and be open about what that experience is like. And so as this initiative came to bear, a very quick sort of reaction we were getting from feedback from folks who were attending various focus groups was a sense that we really needed something different, something separate, and something protected for those who are actually experiencing the impact and are the victims, if you will, of these harms in our society. But really what I would say was that key spark that brought our group together, that brought the wonderful co-facilitators that I work with into this initiative to think together about what can we do to really make this come to life and really make this a steady, continuous, protected space for folks to come and address these experiences, was the killing of Walter Wallace Jr. right in Philadelphia, which I think understandably produced a very strong emotional reaction amongst folks in the Penn community, particularly those of us who are Black and brown who could see ourselves in this gentleman. And so it was around the time of that particular incident that our group really came together and started to think about, well, how do we put this together? What do we do about addressing this particular type of pain that folks are experiencing in the community? And so in terms of thinking about how sort of framing ideas of how we might approach sort of framing ideas of how we might approach this, and again, me and my co-facilitators, I'd say that some of this was kind of pulling it together, myself with ideas, Zim with ideas, kind of moving along. But I want to share some pieces from history, from the literature, that one might consider in terms of what does make sense when one is trying to create a support space where one is really looking to support the needs of people of a marginalized identity who have been victimized by these particular types of experiences, or are going through the vicarious trauma that we can experience when we see something like this going on in our community. And so the first thing I want to talk about is something that has been studied decades in the psychotherapy literature, but thinking about the nature of when you're able to connect with a person who has an identity match in terms of seeking wellness, seeking mental health care. What does that mean for you? Is that necessary to receive support? Is that sufficient? And it's interesting sort of looking at some of the research literature about this. I was reviewing a 2011 meta-analysis of what is decades of literature looking at particularly race and ethnicity match between a client and a therapist. This is sort of more formal mental health treatment. I will say that Space of Color is not a formal mental health endeavor, but we draw inspiration from formal mental health treatment. And I think it is an interesting mixed literature, but something that we do see sort of validated in decades of research, validated upon meta-analysis, looking at different effect sizes, that as far as client preference, particularly for folks of marginalized identity, there is a strong preference typically for having a provider where there is some degree of match in terms of giving that sense of comfort to bring that person through the door in the first place. We also see that as far as perception of the provider, kind of is the perception positive, is the perception negative, that this is something that is also influenced by identity match, and that identity match by race, ethnicity is associated with that stronger positive association. Literature on outcomes in terms of does this truly matter for the course of treatment are, interestingly enough, a little bit more mixed, but I'll say in terms of what this is just one of the things that was sort of bouncing around in my head as I was thinking about what are we going to do in terms of creating this thing that became Spaces of Color. And so a piece that I had in mind as I was pondering how best to approach this was that research like this, which certainly resonates with my own experience, that although one certainly does not need to be of the same identity and background as the person we're working with to provide good service, that there is something to kind of bringing that person through the door, particularly when a person is of a background where they've historically been shut out from certain systems or marginalized or not treated particularly well by certain systems, that there can be something inviting about walking into the door of a form of care that can be a little bit intimidating, a little bit stigmatized, a little bit something that a person may be hesitating to do in the first place. There can be something to coming in and seeing a person like you and having that sense of this person may understand this particular type of my experience. And so I had that in mind as I was thinking with my colleagues about what could make the most sense in terms of putting this sort of mental health informed wellness initiative together, that this could be important in terms of thinking about who we were trying to target and who we wanted to support. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about employee resource groups, or another common term that folks on the call may have heard are affinity groups. And this is basically groups within professional spaces that are not specifically focused on mental health, but are more focused around bringing together people of marginalized background for really mainly focused around things like professional development, career advancement, and also advocating for fairness in the workplace. And ensuring that discrimination is not occurring. So employer resource groups have a long, rich history, actually going back to the 1960s. I think interestingly, thinking about even parallels to the current moment and the sorts of things that kind of light that fire and inspire the creation of these much needed sorts of resources to support people with marginalized identity. Employee resource groups, sort of the spark for these first coming about in the United States, did actually spring from a situation of troubled interactions between Black Americans and the police. Basically a series of race riots that occurred in Rochester, New York in the 1960s following the arrest of a man at a block party in that community. And really, I say much like the moment that we experienced a few years ago, this resulted in a bubbling over of sort of long simmering tensions that resulted from a group of folks who had been kept down, marginalized, sort of shut out of whether it was employment opportunities, housing opportunities, all the opportunities that lead to sort of wealth and success and happiness, that this sort of bubbled over in this moment into a 3-day riot, basically. And so around that time, in part in response to that riot, interestingly, the CEO of Xerox came together with some of his Black employees. I guess he had sort of made an effort to bring employees into his workspace, but had both noting the riots and also noting the experience of folks coming into the workspace and kind of having that first foot in the door, but perhaps not always feeling welcome once they had that space in the workplace, not necessarily feeling that they were being treated in the right way. He worked with his employees to create the National Black Employees Caucus. And this was the first employee resource group in an employment setting, at least that we have sort of documented in the history. This was followed by the Black Women's Leadership Caucus at Xerox as well. Hewlett-Packard had one of the first recorded employee resource groups specifically for folks of the LGBTQ identity. And so I share that just as a piece of history as far as the roots in the civil rights movement of thinking about within an employment context, the importance of having spaces for people of a shared identity or a shared experience to come together, both to share what they are going through and look for that commonality and that sense of togetherness in a particular form of struggle, but also to find arenas for advocacy and arenas for pushing for certain policy changes as far as what could increase fairness in the treatment of everybody in an organization. I'll say that, in spite of the fact that there has been interest interest for decades in terms of employee resource groups, there's little, at least as far as I could find, in the way of formal research on employee research groups or employee resource groups. And particularly focusing on their sort of research, specifically focusing on the impact of folks of the racial and ethnic minority identity, of the BIPOC identity, is actually pretty limited. And I'll just briefly say that some of the research in terms of outcomes, in terms of employee resource groups, is not so much focused on health and wellness. This is mostly in the business literature, mostly focused on, I'd say understandably, given the kind of the main thrust of employee resource groups, more focused on things like, do these groups lead to advancements in career development? Is the creation of these groups associated with larger organizational or policy change within the workplace environment? And so that's also the second sort of historical sort of research background that I want to share as far as things that were bouncing, again, just things that I was thinking about with my group of colleagues as we were thinking about spaces of color together. That's certainly an idea I had in mind. So we know that affinity groups are a common thing in our spaces. Should we be drawing on some of the lessons learned from those sorts of spaces as far as thinking about what we could do with something like spaces of color? Now, the last piece that I want to share is something really more specific to mental health. And so I think being mindful and careful here as far as how I frame that of course, being of the racial and ethnic minority identity is a very different type of identity and experience from having the identity of living with a mental illness. They're, of course, differing but intersectional identities, and that many folks are experiencing both. But that this is a very different, distinct type of identity, and that in one case we are talking about a health condition, whereas in another piece we're talking about more of a sociocultural identity. But that being said, I think something that was in the back of my mind as I was thinking about how to put together spaces of color and thinking about how I could draw lessons from my own mental health background and particularly community and public psychiatry is in terms of what can work best when people are in a difficult situation and looking for support and looking for healing. Something that was definitely in the back of my mind was what is the power of lived experience, and that there is something different about when a person can come to another person to provide support and not only be there as a sympathetic ear, but be able to say, I have been through what you are going through, and I understand exactly what it's like in your shoes because I've been there too. That there's a unique power to that. And those of us who work in mental health, we know that because we have particular types of professionals who are specifically in that role called peer specialists. People who have had a lived experience with mental illness are at a point in their recovery where they are able to be there and support somebody else and specifically draw on their own lived experience in order to support that person. And I'll say, as a person in public and community mental health, I'm sort of privileged to work with these professionals quite often. I'm struck and humbled, I think, all the time about the degree to which folks in this role can do so much more than I can simply from having been in the shoes of the person that I'm working with. That there is nothing, I think, all our wonderful training and background. Lucy mentioned that I have my fancy degrees and awards and this and that. But I think there is nothing that is quite the same as being able to sit across from somebody and say, I know exactly what this is like. And I've been in the hospital just like you. I've been in treatment just like you. And I'm going to connect with you on that level. And so again, while knowing that this is very different from race, ethnicity, I had that in the back of my mind, thinking about that power of a lived experience and that you can really connect with people and provide support in a different way when you can say truly, genuinely, and authentically, I have been there too. And that is something that we see supported in the literature evidence, that there's an array of research, certified peer specialists, at least on the mental health side, are an evidence-based practice in public and community mental health, and have an array of particularly very positive self-report outcomes from patients who work with peer specialists in terms of a sense of wellness, of social increased social support and social functioning, feeling a sense of acceptance and empathy, and even some good clinical outcomes for this particular population. And so, again, just framing this was sort of a third evidence-based thing that I had in my mind, that I knew we wouldn't be doing something exactly like this, but I just sort of had in mind as I was thinking about what we could do with spaces of color, that there is a really strong power in terms of lived experience and having been there if you're going to try to support somebody who has been through something difficult. And thinking to myself, well, how do we think about that in the context of racism and racial trauma? And could we have some similarity there as far as those who have been through this being in a uniquely powerful role to be able to support others who go through experiences like this? And so with all that framing, again, I put all those framing of things that I was thinking about at the time, things that I've, in a sense, looked more into in retrospect, because I would say that this was really spaces of color. Much of this was myself and this wonderful group of facilitators working together to kind of draw on our gut instinct from our training background as caregivers, myself and being in mental health specifically, to think about, well, how exactly are we going to put this together in a way that feels right and resonates with our past experiences and expertise, for what could be helpful to people who are struggling in this moment of this tremendous vicarious trauma of these incidents of racism. And so starting out, I think that, I've been thinking about drawing on some of the things that I've shared so far and bringing together our group of facilitators. And these were folks who spontaneously came forward, willing to put forth their time and effort, feeling passionate about this work. That definitely a piece that I had in mind as I came together with these colleagues was that we had all had, unfortunately, lived experiences with various forms of racism, of microaggressions, of more overt incidents, and that would be a power that we would potentially bring to this initiative as far as how to support others through this. I basically, as part of bringing this group together, I'm the one facilitator who has a formal mental health background. My other colleagues are in nursing and pastoral care, so I have that depth of experience in the caregiving role in other disciplines. But I created and provided sort of a basic training around things, some of our more formal mental health principles like supportive psychotherapy, interventions, how to think about group dynamics, just to give a little bit of that foundation, even though I was mindful that we were not doing a formal sort of group therapy or formal mental health treatment, but wanting to share with my colleagues some of those principles from my training background that could be useful in terms of bringing these groups together. And so from there, I would say really it was just that leap of faith of we put together a Zoom room, we got some advertising going and just sort of started to share with the community, hey, we are going to be holding these spaces, confidential spaces, a key piece of this as far as never revealing the folks who have attended the groups, that these spaces were going to be spaces for open dialogue, for processing, for healing. And so we showed up in the Zoom room and just looked to see what would happen and hope that we had folks arrive and hope we had folks who would take or draw something from the program. And so ultimately this became a monthly series and still is today, where we basically provide monthly evening Zoom groups in this format. say in terms of how the structure sort of evolved as we moved along, we quickly found, and I'll imagine folks who've done, say, group therapy work, other forms of group work may have had a similar experience, that sometimes when you sort of open a space for dialogue without a particular theme or particular prompt, the first response you may get is silence and hesitance for anybody to leap in and be that first person to share a reflection. I think especially something as challenging and personal as an experience with racism. And so how we evolved over time was to start to have our programs have specific topics that we would then advertise out to the Penn community. This is going to be the theme for this session. This is going to be the theme for this session. Just have a little bit of a jumping off point for the group's dialogue, always with the framing that anyone participating in the group didn't have to stick to the theme, that it was really an open space to share any reflection that a person felt right in sharing, and hoping to give people a little source of inspiration. Most recently, one of our newer endeavors over the past year, which again was an idea that came from several of the facilitators in the group, that we thought simply this seems like it would be a good route as far as a way to frame this, or a way to provide a resource and work with a resource to promote healing, is we've been working chapter by chapter through a book on racialized work trauma called Right Within. It's written by a professional named Minda Hartz, who basically has put together several books detailing her own experiences with racialized workplace trauma and sort of walking step by step through some of her lessons learned in terms of how to heal, how to process this sort of trauma, how to work through it when one is still in the environment where it originally occurred, how to sort of prepare oneself for future environments where this might occur. So again, I'd say, speaking to that piece of, was it fully of the evidence base necessarily to work through this book? I'd say, not necessarily, but we sense that this was a book that really resonated with several folks in our facilitator group, that really hit people as far as this is what this is like. And this book has a powerful message that could be healing for folks out there. And so that was our inspiration to sort of bring that into the space. So these other things in terms of our structure, I think our most important piece is the aspect of confidentiality. We try to keep the space very open and flexible as far as both active and passive participation. We're very explicit about not tolerating sort of slurs or offensive language or disrespect towards others. And that's essentially how we have framed the groups and sort of stood them up. So I'm going to share a little bit about our program outcomes. And I'll say, as part of that piece around confidentiality, I'm not going to share anything as far as like any sort of specific reflections or stories or any of the sort of the content that has come up in these sessions. But I wanted to share a little bit about some of the feedback we've gotten from folks who have participated through a post-session survey, basically, that we distribute to the group. I'd say one of the most positive and invigorating things that we have seen in terms of folks participating in spaces of color is the likelihood to refer a friend. That we've fortunately seen this very positive sense of coming out from the group, having experienced that this is the sort of initiative to which folks who have participated in the groups would refer a colleague or refer a friend. And so we have taken that to heart as hopefully we're doing something positive and doing something right here. In terms of what folks have shared that they have found helpful in the sessions, again, keeping this very broad and general, some of the themes that I would draw out from the post-session survey comments would be things like folks really valuing the confidentiality of the space, the sense of community, the sense of authenticity, the non-judgmental listening of having others hear one's experience, as well as shared experiences, that sense of I'm not alone because other people are going through similar things to what I have experienced. And then just sharing a little bit about ups and downs and fluctuations in terms of our registration. I'd say our main lessons learned there have been that, of course, holiday season is not always the best time to hold these sessions, that, you do need to give people to have just their own healing of being away, whether it's a break for the summer or break for the winter holidays. But we also did learn that something specific like the Right Within book, having that as a theme, really seemed to be something that boosted up our attendance. It was in January of 2023 that we first introduced that as a series. And so that's a lesson that we have learned as far as our sort of incorporated into our thinking as far as steps that we might take next and thinking about how we plan our content. I'd say in terms of the August bar being a big jump too, I think there can be something to putting forth a big sort of outreach push right as folks are coming into that new academic term and sort of newly joining the community, particularly at the university. Just in terms of this is just some other outcomes. In addition to our monthly sessions, we have a community page where we basically post we post a sign up for our monthly sessions. We also post other content that we hope might be useful to folks who have been through experiences of racism, who may not feel called to join a group, but may be interested in podcasts or articles or other forms of media from which they might draw healing or draw a sense of processing of these experiences. And so we build that page out based on recommendations from facilitators as well as attendees, that as folks share ideas in terms of resources, a great article that they read, a great podcast that they listened to, a great video that they saw that they found inspiring, that they found empowering in terms of identity, we post those up on our community page for folks to take a look at. And so coming to the closing of my remarks here in terms of what I feel I have learned in doing this initiative, one, I really want to emphasize as far as having success in an initiative like this, that I think it is so important to think about that bottom-up aspect of providing services to the community. And that's something that has been part of my sort of training and background being in public and community mental health. But I think particularly when we are thinking about equity, when we are thinking about providing support and resources to those of us who have been historically shut out, marginalized, and frankly harmed by our society, I think it is hard to have success if one doesn't start with what the community is looking for and what the community needs, and have folks of that community be at the table and part of the conversation in terms of building an initiative. And so for me, when I think about some of the positives and successes that we've had with Spaces of Color, I do think that is a key piece of the power, that it was several of us coming together, feeling called to this organically, and drawing on our own ideas and inspiration in terms of how to put this together, rather than the structure or the format being dictated to us in terms of what this needed to look like. Second lesson learned, and I already have referenced this a little bit, but again, I'd say sort of almost like a useful sort of reverse dynamic for me as somebody who's been in kind of this nerdy, scholarly, academic space of, well, what's in this journal article that I can find to figure out how to do this the right way. I can say that at times I have a nervousness about how we were approaching this, thinking about, well, do we have a good evidence base? Do we know that this is definitely going to work? But I think that what I found is that there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in the anecdotal experiences, particularly for those who have lived through the challenges of racism and inequity. I have learned a tremendous amount from the facilitators that I am working with, simply because they have lived through and been through things that I have not, in terms of their breadth of life experience, and having that gut instinct of what is going to potentially be most helpful to sort of fellowship and commune and connect with other people in the community. And so that's been a very valuable lesson for me, that it's sometimes about sort of searching within oneself and thinking about, what have I found in my life experiences in this realm that I can draw upon that would be most valuable to share and connect with others. Say another key lesson learned, again, without delving into the specific content of what folks have shared in our groups, I'm sure many on the call won't be surprised to hear that a key lesson learned in terms of some of the experiences that folks are going through here at Penn is that there is a lot of work still to do. It's staggering to learn about the ways in which folks, both in big ways and small, are experiencing microaggressions, having the experience of having to work twice as hard to get half as far, experiencing outright overt discrimination. And I think it's incredibly important that this institution stay vigilant and challenge itself to be really thoughtful about how is it going about getting that feedback and that information in ways perhaps outside of a confidential space like Spaces of Color. Do we have structures in place to really draw upon what our minority employees in particular are going through, what our folks of marginalized identity are experiencing, and thinking about how we can be proactive in protecting people against these experiences, because there is certainly a great deal of work to do. And then the last brief piece I'll share, and this is sort of being mindful that although this I think there's still a lot of lack of clarity as far as where the recent Supreme Court decision will touch some of our different equity and DEI focused initiatives. I think a key sort of protective piece for us and a lesson learned as far as making sure we could do the work that we wanted to do, but do it in a way that protected us and was mindful of these sorts of factors, was to work with our legal office here at Penn to make sure we were framing things in the right way and really zero in on focusing on we are providing something for people who have been through a particular experience. And this is the experience of racism and racial trauma. And that was a helpful framing for us as far as making sure that we were presenting this in a way where we were sort of protected and could keep this initiative going. And so with that, I'm going to thank you for hearing my reflections. Up here, I have a QR code, which will take you to the Spaces of Color community page. I encourage you to take a look. We don't have any current sort of our future sessions posted now because we're about to go into a holiday pause, but I encourage you to bookmark the site, share it with colleagues in the Penn community who you think could benefit, because this is sort of our main landing page where we post up our sessions, as well as our other content to try to promote this form of healing in the Penn community. And so I'm going to pause there and stop sharing my screen.
So thank you so much, Rachel. And I think we're a small enough group that if people want to raise their hands, it would be great to get questions, or you can just put your question in the chat, whichever you prefer. Sabrina.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Lucy. Hi, everybody. So good to see you all. I'm sorry you're not seeing me, but you don't want to. So question I have is, how many men are in this group in terms of spaces of color?
Well, it's an interesting thing that you point out, because I would say all of our facilitators do identify as female. Again, I want to be careful about how much I share about who is and isn't attending the group, but I don't sort of truly sort of track in terms of numbers who exactly is attending as opposed to who signs up. But I will say I have more often seen folks who are identifying as female, and to me, I think that's an interesting thing, because I even think about that in terms of our mental health care and thinking about folks of marginalized identity, and how, well, I think that people of minoritized race and ethnicity across the board often are not as able to engage in mental health care, as able to be retained in mental health care, do not feel as welcomed. That I think that issue is particularly stark for men of the minoritized racial and ethnic identity. And so it's an interesting issue, and definitely something that our team has even talked about, is whether if we could identify somebody interested in facilitating who is male, that potentially that could be a bigger draw. I think speaking to the fact that when you see that matched identity and see somebody who you feel you can resonate with being part of the sort of the leadership of a group, that could be something that could draw some more folks who are male into the group.
So I led with my question, but I definitely want to say that it's an outstanding presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, boss. That's especially nice hearing from Cabrina, because she is my boss.
You have a great boss. Gina.
Hi, everyone. And Rachel, thank you for an amazing presentation and for this amazing program. I had two questions for you. So the first one is, and you may not want to share this, which I understand. I'm curious about the, I guess, the distribution of staffing groups who come. Like, do more faculty come? Do more staff come? Is it a mix? And then of staff, are they like, are there groups like security or EVS or people that work in the cafeteria? Are those types of staffing groups coming to this type of forum, or is it different? Like, do nurses come? I'm just curious, like, who comes? My second question is, if you've had any issues with people coming who don't appear to be from a minoritized group, and of course, appearances can be, people can look all sorts of ways, but have there been any issues with people coming who maybe shouldn't be there? I
appreciate both questions, and I will say I'm going to be thoughtful and careful about how I answer both. So I'd say first, in terms of folks attending, and again, I want to keep it general because I want to be mindful of the fact that we really hold this as a confidential space and don't like to say a lot about who is or isn't coming. What I'd say is it's been a pretty broad range that I think that we still have some work to do as far as kind of really reaching folks who are in our most frontline positions. And actually, feedback I have heard from some folks, not in the group, but sort of outside in talking about the group, is that there can be a hesitation about a group appearing like sort of a top-down effort, even if we are a bit more bottom-up, and kind of a hesitation and suspicion of, is this really going to be what it looks like? So I found the best that we can do with that is just encouraging folks to spread the word of mouth. We've done a little bit of sort of just walking around the hospital community with our flyers and our QR code, so people can see, yep, here I am. I'm a human being, and this is me, not just the person in that PM report email blast. But it's been a bit of I'd say it's been a range sort of across folks in different roles. The second question is interesting because I will say, you'll note that if you look at our language, this group is stated as being for anyone who's had firsthand experience with racism and racial trauma. We don't dictate that a person has to be of a particular identity, because that in part that would actually be against some Department of Education regulations. But we're very specific that we're looking for that this is meant to be a space for people who have that personal firsthand experience. And there's been an occasion here or there where we've had folks who are more, I'd say, looking for that experience of being educated about that experience, perhaps, rather than having gone through it. But at least my experience has been that when folks realize that miscommunication, if you will, and that misunderstanding, folks have been very gracious in terms of taking a step back and recognizing that this is a group for people who have been through a very specific type of firsthand experience.
Others. Amber.
Hi, yes, thank you, Rachel, so much for doing this incredibly important and amazing work. I had a question about how you address or acknowledge sort of power differentials within the group, either as a result of differences in positions or other identities that group members hold.
That is an interesting question. I would say, I think part of where, in all honesty, I can't think of, I wouldn't share specific instances anyway, but I can't think of sort of common times when issues like that have come up. I will say, at least in my experience, I think one of the sort of the power and the beauty of this sort of organic experience and how it has cropped up has been, is that for the most part, it's been very rare that people sort of bring their authority, if you will, and their position and that sort of titling into this sort of group. I'll say for myself, I'm always Rachel in the group. I'm not Dr. Talley. I'm not, assistant professor or anything. I'm just Rachel, there to kind of commune with the group and share my experience and hear what others are going through and see if I can connect. And that I think while we have no explicit rules around that, other than that people are we sort of state explicitly that people are welcome to be as open or as not so open about exactly who they are and where they're coming from in the system, that I think that I'd say in a lot of ways, we try to think about that as facilitators in terms of how we set a tone, that we try to set a tone of, this is how we present ourselves. And this is not really about who's in this position or who has this degree or who is a supervisor versus something else. And then I'd say, I think, and kind of fold it into some of our confidentiality guidance when we frame our groups. We do state outright and kind of comment to the fact that people may see people in the group that they may then see in the workspace, that it's like, it's not going to be out of the box, particularly if you've invited a colleague or a friend, right? That you're in the group and then you're back at your desk on Monday morning or whatever it might be. And so we really, I think one thing that I hope helps prevent some of what you're talking about is that as a piece of that confidentiality, we really encourage our participants not only to not share that, what I should say is not only do we guarantee a confidentiality, that we'll never reveal who's attended or share email addresses. Any communications I typically send when I send sort of blast reminders are always blind CC, so even the folks who are part of attending the group can't see the contact info of anybody else. We encourage the group to kind of have that shared responsibility of don't share comments that you heard in the group outside of here. Don't necessarily go to your colleague that you see and say, hey, you remember in Space of Color. That it's like we really ask the group to have that shared commitment to maintaining the confidentiality of what's discussed, to try to really keep it totally separate from workplace dynamics and workplace roles.
Steve?
Rachel, terrific presentation. And I could have had a reaction of clap, because I'd like to clap. And my involvement is generally with the doctoring course in the medical school, where 12 students get together for 2.5 years. It's a variably intimate opportunity for students to talk about all sorts of things. And when I've tried to bring up issues of gender and race, it's not welcome generally. And I wondered, and my parallel question really is, are there opportunities within the School of Medicine for students to have an affinity group? And is it possible to learn from that if those exist?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question, and I'd say in terms of drawing on our experience with spaces of color and some of the things that we have tried, we did try. I think at this point it's about a year or so ago to have a sort of an iteration or a subgroup of spaces of color specific for medical students, and it was in part thinking about, even to Amber's question, kind of thinking about power dynamics and being mindful that as much as our hope with Spaces of Color is that it's this open community that anybody who's had an experience like this feels welcome to come into, that we wondered about people in a trainee position that it could feel hesitant to join a space like this, worrying that if I see my clinical supervisor, if I see my teacher or professor, that this is going to be not the right space. We struggled to get it launched, and I'll be honest, I think it was logistics. That is, as you know as well as I do, that med students are very busy. They have a lot going on, and finding that right time to do it was tough. But I think that there is tremendous power in I think there's tremendous importance for having sort of affinity groups and this sort of support for people who are in medical training. And I'll say one, just in terms of existing affinity groups that are particularly powerful, we have things like the SNMA, like the LMSA, like the Student National Medical Association, Latino Student Medical Association, which are national groups but have local chapters in a lot of medical schools, including Penn. And I think those organizations are tremendous in terms of providing that sense of connection and community and career development. My hope certainly would be that we could find ways to encourage medical students to feel open to come to our general sessions, or even relaunch an effort to have our medical student specific sessions, in part because I think, aside from the connections of an affinity group, there certainly, I think, could be value in having a protected space for folks to process and heal from some of the microaggressions or other incidents that they might be experiencing in their medical training. Because we certainly know, and there's a lot of, I can't quote any of it specifically, but there's a lot of troubling data coming out as far as folks in medical training of the minority identity being sort of pushed out of training, dropping out of training, kind of essentially feeling unwelcome and struggling to finish that path because of incidents of discrimination and not being treated fairly, not being evaluated fairly. And so in a long nutshell, I would say I think that there are excellent groups that are already out there. I would love to have a space of color specific to provide that more mental health focused well-being support. And then I think there's a lot of work to do in medical training specifically in terms of making sure trainees both feel emotionally supported, but also feel protected in terms of some of the things that they are going through and what their avenues are to sort of seek redress when they go through something.
Thank you.
Kimberly?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Rachel, for this amazing presentation. It was so great to hear more about the work that you're doing along with the rest of the team. And my question is around additional resources to support the health and wellness of attendees. So I just wanted to know, has anyone from the group so far expressed any interest in additional activities that could support their mental health and wellness, such as meditation or yoga or anything like that?
Well, first, Kim, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
And I will say one, sort of two thoughts in response to that. And of course, I'll keep it broad in general as far as anything that anyone specifically has called for. That probably one of the most common, I'd say this is almost a universal thing I've heard. And so I don't see it as sort of a breaking of confidentiality, and that I can't think of anyone even peripherally involved as a facilitator who's thought about the group who hasn't brought this up, is that just in terms of even traditional mental health treatment, I think we have a lot of work to do in our institution in terms of resources. And that's a huge issue outside of Penn. That just is a national issue as far as, I think, supply of mental health providers of a minority background, whether it's therapists, whether it's psychiatrists. And I think going along with that, even thinking about some of these other sort of wellness focused and mindfulness focused activities like yoga, like meditation, I think we're a little bit limited in terms of having those resources that are sort of presented in a way that's framed to uniquely resonate with people of a marginalized minority identity or have been through a racism experience. I will call out, I'll say with an apology that my information not be current as far as whether this is still going on, but there is a professional at Penn who has been running sort of meditation mindfulness spaces specifically for folks who are of that minoritized identity, have been through these experiences. We have that posted up on the Spaces of Color community page. I don't know a great deal as far as sort of uptake of that or how many folks have been attending that. But I think I might say just sort of across the board, whether it's formal sort of therapy and psychiatry, whether it's some of these more mindfulness focused or meditation activities, that I think there's much more that we need in terms of thinking about having a supply of those in general for people to take advantage of, but also having them, whether it's based on the identity of the provider or how they're framed in terms of theme and content, really matching the experience of people who have been through racism and people who are racial and ethnic minorities. And I would say, Kim, I appreciate the work that you do in that space, because I know you do quite a bit.
Rachel, I have a question. You have access to some of the issues that people are bringing that are institutional and systemic. And are there ways that you are able, without in any way jeopardizing confidentiality, are there ways that you are able to speak to at the institutional level to try to make change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say that I will challenge myself, that I will say that I should be doing more, frankly, I think, and as far as thinking about how to sort of package and think about how to sort of generally share some of the information that we receive in spaces without violating confidentiality, but kind of sort of projecting some of the issues of what people are bringing up, that I have not done a great deal proactively, I'd say. But when I've been asked, and there have been one or two occasions when I've been asked to sort of share feedback, share information for some of our anti-racism focus committees at Penn, and how I've approached that is basically just very broad general summaries of some of the themes, but really trying to hit on particularly the ways in which we hear from folks that there's a real appetite for broader institutional change, that there is a feeling of some of it, that our policies, our protections, whether it's around what one can do when one has experienced discrimination, whether it's navigating the issues of sort of having a problem with a supervisor, where there isn't sort of that safe space to seek redress and share what's going on. I have had a few opportunities where I try to just sort of very generally summarize some of the themes that I am hearing and then present them in a way that feels right to our attendees in terms of never revealing a specific anecdote, never revealing a specific experience, but more sharing, broadly speaking. I have heard from folks that this is the type of things that are going on that our institution really needs to do a better job of addressing. So yes, I've had, I can think of one or two occasions when I've been asked to talk with some of our anti-racism committees, and I've eagerly taken that platform to try to push for some of these changes and encourage the idea that while Spaces of Color is a wonderful thing to do, and has been an inspiring and fulfilling thing to do, it's been troubling as far as what folks are going through, and that I think well-being support alone, of course, is not going to be the solution to these issues, that we need the sorts of changes that will prevent these incidents from happening in the first place. That's really the key problem. So yes, as I've done what I can, and I think, as should be the case for all of us, have felt that there's also more that I could do, that I hope to do.
Great, good, because it sounds like you should be providing some roadmaps for the institution in some sense. And so I hope that that is possible. And if there's any way Focus can support you in that, we would love to do so. Any other questions? I just want to say, I think this work is incredible, and the fact that you and your colleagues did it, actually thought of doing it and making it possible for people is just wonderful. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And if anyone has any questions that they prefer not to do in a group, I'm sure Rachel will be happy to have them. Hillary?
I meant to clap and not actually raise my hand. But so thank you so much, Rachel. But I do have a question. I'm Hillary Bugner. I'm a mental health researcher. And when I tell people that, they say, can you find me someone to see my kids? So, and I find that among faculty, staff, everybody. I was just wondering if you get a lot of people worrying about their kids.
Yeah, I'm thinking again. I don't want to be too specific to anything in particular. I've heard from one or two individuals in the group. I'd say interesting. I don't know if that's been a strong theme, and I think in part because we do kind of our explicit framing that we're not a source of formal mental health treatment. So I'd say within the group, maybe not so much. I'll say generally in the community, being a community mental health provider, I sadly hear this all the time, and I think a lot of it is a function of just this tremendous lack of resources, lack of culturally congruent resources, that there are not enough providers and not enough mindful providers to necessarily go around.
But I meant to clap.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And if anybody has any thoughts, please do share them with us. And your work is amazing.
Thank you. And I will shout out my facilitator group again. Again, pleased to share this group. I will say one name I left off the slide. Larissa Morgan was one of our foundational members in terms of bringing this together and has done tremendous work in the equity space here at UPenn. And so I share this work with my colleagues who I do it with, and I'm just happy to give it more of a platform and more of a voice. And I will say, please spread the word. If you have colleagues who could benefit, if you yourself feel you could benefit, please consider joining us. We actually have a session coming up this Thursday. So
Rachel, one last comment I wanted to make is that it is so wonderful that this is being sustained, because oftentimes, things that happen in 2020 have dwindled by the wayside. And so that is really a testament to what you guys are doing, is that you're able to sustain this ongoing important work.
Indeed. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you so much, Rachel.
All right. Thank you, Kabrina. And thank you, everyone.